Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Peter Jennings, and I go by CSURAM88 across the daily fantasy industry. And pumped to be back again here at FantasyLabs doing another model preview. If you guys follow the content I do, I also do some work for DraftKings with the DFS Edge. And I just wanted to let you guys know this is being recorded on Wednesday, and I've gotten a lot of feedback lately. These are just opinions. Things can change, but certainly this is how I feel here on Wednesday morning when I record it. Also, one important note, when looking at this, I have sliders weighted like projections points per dollar at a pretty high amount, and our projections here at Fantasy Labs do change throughout the week. So let's dive into the model that I made. I'm previewing the wide receiver position again because I think it's a really interesting position this week. There's a lot of ways to go, and I'll talk a little bit about roster construction this week and where I think a lot of people will be leaning with certain positions. So let's take a look here at the model, and we'll discuss some of the guys that are popping here. So the Vegas score, I have at 10 points. I always have this in. If you are on Fantasy Labs, you can also go to our Vegas page and see a lot of really relevant stuff about line moves and team totals and things of that nature. I always like having it in my model. I have opponent rating at 20, and in some of the models I've made, I've actually weighted this as high as 50 points just to see certain positions, how they do against teams, and I think it's really, really interesting to see who's popping based on that. Projected points per dollar, I have at 30. I talked about this in the beginning of the video. This is something that I always have, a huge part of my model, and our projections do change throughout the week. And you can actually edit the projections. So I'm pretty bullish on Alshon Jeffrey. I'm actually going to bump him up here to 21 points in this model. And you can update any projections that you want here with guys, and it's something that I'm always doing and tweaking on my own as well. We have projected plus minus at 25 points. That's a stat that is proprietary to Fantasy Labs, and it takes into account the salary. This is how we're getting ratings for certain guys, and you can see here Alshon's rating just went up with that projection, but guys are rating really well, like Dontrell Inman, who I like a lot this week. He's not projected to have the second most fantasy points, but his salary is great, and I actually think he's projected to score significantly more than 9.4, so let's even put him to 15, and you'll see him jump to be really highly rated, right up there with Alshon Jeffrey. So basically at this point, I have the key metrics that I always put in my model for the receiver position. I sometimes bake in stats like ceiling and upside. I did that for this one, specifically do 5 points towards ceiling. And then a stat that I really like looking at is market share. And basically this will tell us which guys are getting a high percent of the targets, yards, and touchdowns. And if we scroll through the models here, this is one of my favorite things. You can see the percentage of receiving targets they have out of the receivers, receiving touchdowns, and the receiving yards. So I love looking at this data and figuring out, basically who's going to be the big beneficiary of good matchups and in what regard. One thing to pay attention to on DraftKings is you're getting bonuses for yards and reception, or you're getting bonuses for yards, and you're getting a full point for receptions. So the targets and the yardage are more important on DraftKings than, say, a site like FanDuel, where you're really looking for touchdown equity. So let's take a look here at the model and what it spit out. Again, it's backtesting somewhat well, 3.4 points, not great. You can definitely get higher backtesting miles than that by weighting projected points per dollar and projected plus minus a little bit more heavily. But I like the results that's spitting out here. And let's talk about the guys at the top of the list in the model. Alshon Jeffrey, I absolutely love in this spot. I think he has a chance to put up a huge game. We've seen him play a lot better with Jay Cutler, and I really like this matchup as well. Tampa Bay is going to be good against the run, and you should be able to throw a ton against Tampa Bay. We saw Carr and Cooper go off against Tampa Bay recently as well. Obviously saw Atlanta put up a ton of points. So I think this is a good matchup for Cutler and Jeffrey, and I really like his spot. You see here we have him projected really to be one of the more heavily owned players on the entire slate as of right now, and projections will change. Projected ownership will also change throughout the week. Adam Levitan is taking a big look at that, and something that I'm definitely looking at as well. Dontrell Inman is one of my favorite plays. One thing I love about Dontrell Inman is the uptick in targets we're seeing. The Chargers are dealing with a lot of injuries in the receiving core, obviously. I mean, Started the year with a devastating blow to Keenan Allen, who had had a huge year based on how the offense is playing. Now Tyrell Williams is beat up. Benjamin might even sit this week potentially. We'll see what happens. He's dealing with a PCL injury. Hunter Henry missed last week. So the guy who's leading in snaps and seeing a lot of opportunity is Dontrell Inman, and he dropped a touchdown last week. Definitely a lot of opportunity for him going forward. I love Dontrell Inman in this spot, and he's at a great price tag. And if you want to afford the expensive running backs like David Johnson, Le'Veon Bell, Ezekiel Elliott, Inman's going to be a big key to that. So I do think he's going to be pretty heavily owned, but I do love Dontrell Inman a lot this week. Steve Smith's popping. I ruptured my Achilles almost 8 months ago. Starting to get healthy now, which is nice. Still a long ways away from being 100% or at my max. There's going to be some slow growth, but I am feeling a lot better. I'm amazed at how well Steve Smith has played. No surprise he missed some games with injury. I think he's going to be fighting to stay on the field throughout the rest of the season, but it's certainly a good spot. I prefer Mike Wallace over Steve Smith in this game personally, but I certainly have to recognize that I'm biased towards guys coming back from Achilles injuries because I know how devastating it is. Jamarcus Nelson, like him quite a bit as a tournament play. If you want to pivot away from David Johnson in tournaments, I think the Arizona passing game makes sense. Coming off a huge game against Carolina, a ton of targets. This guy ran a 4.28 40, one of the fastest players in the NFL. And against San Francisco, I mean, you want to pick on guys against Cleveland. You want to pick guys against San Francisco. So I really like Nelson in this spot quite a bit. And I think he has a big ceiling here, especially with his speed. Antonio Brown, cheap price. It's kind of tough to figure out what to do with the Pittsburgh guys at home. Hopefully Big Ben's healthy. I mean, in the past we just jammed in Antonio Brown when he was at this price and Big Ben was the quarterback, especially at home. I think that there's a lot of merit to that. The only reason for concern really is Dallas has been great at hogging the football. They actually have played pretty decent defense. I don't think they're rushing the passer that well, though, so I think that's going to help Antonio Brown in the passing game. Demaryius Thomas, the Broncos receivers are really interesting this week against New Orleans. I do think that they make a good stack with Simeon, and that's something that I'll definitely be looking at. Let's see here. Sterling Shepard, I can get behind. I love his talent. Loved him at Oklahoma. Love Jordan Matthews in the spot. I think Wentz and Jordan Matthews makes a great stack this week. I think a lot of people will be overlooking that and actually like the Eagles in this spot. John Brown, the sickle cell thing is tough for me, so we'll have to pay attention to that throughout the week. Seeing Montgomery limited, seeing him limited. Coleman's had some issues now. It's just that sickle cell stuff is tough. AJ Green will probably be very underowned. I imagine a lot of people will go to Antonio Brown when they're looking at the top-end receivers, and I think that will lead to a lower ownership on AJ Green. So I think he certainly makes a viable GPP play. Larry Fitzgerald's a fine play, just kind of expensive. I think he might be lower owned because of how expensive he is. I think Odell Beckham will probably garner more ownership because we saw him have those touchdowns last week than AJ Green, but I could be wrong. Interested to see how that breaks down. Like Emmanuel Sanders, who I talked about. I like both Broncos pass catchers quite a bit. Mike Wallace, I love in this spot. The Green Bay receivers are tough to figure out now with Cobb and obviously Montgomery being limited, but they're saying he's a 3-down back. Then you have Devontae Adams, Jordy Nelson. I think I prefer Jordy Nelson actually the most out of this group, and I talked about it on the FantasyLabs podcast. And if we look here, scroll back down, I guess I just missed it. But yeah, Jordy Nelson right here. If we scroll through here and we talk about those market share percentages, I think he makes a lot of sense on FanDuel as a play because he's catching such a high percentage of the receiving touchdowns. He is seeing a lot of deep targets as well, so the upside's there. I do like him a decent bit here on DraftKings as well. Tyrell the Gazelle Williams, like him if he's healthy, pay attention to his status. Same thing with Mike Evans. He should be rated higher, assuming he's healthy. Still in the concussion protocol here, though, on Wednesday. DeAndre Hopkins is a really cheap price. I don't mind buying that. The only concern I have is that Jalen Ramsey will be covering him. I talked about that on the podcast as well. I think Jalen Ramsey for the Jaguars is an up-and-coming star at the cornerback position. Definitely has the body and the ability to shut guys down. Still learning, but down the road, I think he'll be one of the elite shutdown corners. I would love Will Fuller in this spot if I knew he was okay, but certainly need more news on the Texans passing game. Not too many other guys. Julio, I probably won't have too much Julio. I think I prefer Antonio Brown, but this is certainly a spot you can go after with Julio. I mean, if you look at Julio's game log, it's just ridiculous. So many monster performances. Has had a couple duds, though, as well. So it's tough. I mean, he has a 2-pointer, a 5-pointer, and a 6-pointer, essentially. And then he also has a 51, a 29, 29, 28. So GPP exposure for sure, but for cash games, I'm probably leaning towards Antonio Brown if I'm spending up at receiver. Jarvis Landry, big disappointment, which he was cheaper. At some point, he'll have a big game, but he's burned me quite a bit so far. I did play him in some cash last week, and that didn't work out. Yeah, this is kind of the gist. You see Devontae Adams down here. I mean, there's a lot of guys to consider here. And that's one of the nice things about the receiver position this week. There's a ton of different guys to choose from, and there's a lot of stacks that make a lot of sense. And I think a lot of people are going to have similar rosters where they take the expensive running backs and lean on cheap receivers. So the one thing I would say for tournaments is look to leverage potentially different roster constructions with expensive receivers and cheap running backs to get an edge on the field in the tournaments. So with that, again, I'm Peter Jennings. I go by CSURAM88 across the industry. As always, I'm looking to see more Fantasy Lab subscribers at the top of the leaderboard, and good luck to everyone tonight.